we're welcoming Kent Rogers. And let me just introduce Kent a little bit. So Kent is currently the CEO of Everyone Medicines. And, but this is, I think he will explain to us what it really is. So I just don't want to get even on some eyes here to misinterpret this. But at the same time, you're also partnered at Arch Venture Partners, right? But beside that, there is a long career already, 30 years in the healthcare industry. And I just call out a few: EQ Therapeutics, Accorda Therapeutics, Merck Sharing, right? So a number of really, heavyweights in the industry. But also, as I realized, you have been on the other side when you worked for one of, I guess, what people say are the payer side of the industry. So at your time at Optum, right? So really, I mean, a huge experience. And we are looking forward to hear more about this with regard to scalable, sustainable solutions for individualized ASO therapies. So we heard about ASO earlier. As you know, iXCells provides ASO services too. So let's listen to your wisdom. Very happy to have you here, and thank you very much. Do you need this?
So thank you for having me. As mentioned, my name is Kent Rogers. I'm the CEO of a company called Everyone Medicines. And if you haven't heard of Everyone Medicines, I will provide just a little bit of feedback and background on our start. You will see the founder of our company, actually the two founders of our company, and their picture are on the wall right here, just around the corner. So there is an established relationship with iXCells already. I know I don't need to tell this audience the statistics that you see up here, but I present this deck quite a bit. This is actually part of my pitch deck right now. We're in a Series A raise, which I'll explain that as well. But what's important to understand about what we're doing is that we're committed to the smallest space within already a very small space within rare disease. And I think you're right. Uncommon is a better word. I think we all know rare disease is anything but rare. When you consider the totality of numbers, it's just the occurrence is so infrequent. So we are focused in a space that was really inspired by the fact, and this is something that I've now seen coming into this part of our ecosystem with healthcare. I've been in this industry 30 years, as it was mentioned, and I have never seen anything that has been so unfortunately organized in its disorganization, if that makes sense. Parents that are raising money for their children all over the country, and this is being repeated over and over again, companies starting foundations, and this is an audience that knows this all too well, and that's not a sustainable situation. As mentioned, our company was inspired by the journey that Mila took with her mom, Julia Vitarello. She was the first patient that ever had an ASO designed for her and her unique mutation. They did this within about a year. Now, that doesn't take into account the years-long odyssey that she had to go through to find out what her daughter had. And then when she did, that there is no company researching and or developing these products. And so Tim Yu at Boston Children's actually determined that ASOs was going to be a great modality for her because of her kind of mutation. The treatment actually did help her, but she was 6 when she was starting to become symptomatic, 7 when she was diagnosed. So you can imagine a little body like that had already ravaged her. And so she unfortunately died at the age of 10. But the inspiration that came from that experience motivated Julia to start a company called Everyone Medicines to give everyone, or at least every child, the same chance at life that her daughter Mila had. And so that's what we're going to do. We are going to design, manufacture, and deliver individualized medicines. Our current modality is ASOs. We will expand into other modalities in the future. But I want to underscore this, that while there are a lot of approaches that are going about this, one of the reasons that they asked me to come in is that I don't even know how many drugs I've launched in my career, 3 dozen. And I've been on the buy side as a payer. I've been on the sell side with both large and small pharmaceutical companies. So I understand how the supply chain works, and it's not a fun supply chain, and it's an expensive supply chain, and it's one that doesn't always make a lot of sense, as you guys all know. But I do know how to navigate it, and so I intend to navigate it with these kinds of medications. The good thing too is that when I came in, of the companies that are in this space, I'm already got wind at my back. I've got a very experienced team in the rare space, but we also have top-notch investors. If you're familiar at all with the VC world, which I have been in the VC world for the last 2 years, Khosla, GV, and Baker Brothers are top tier. And so they're actually supporting the company and have been for the last 2 or 3 years. They are committed to the current raise, which is good. But we also have both Tim Yu and Julia involved in our company. Julia is a co-founder. She sits on our board, and Tim is a co-founder and is one of our key strategic advisors. If you're not familiar with ASOs, I'm not going to drain the science because I think a lot of folks are, but they're rather elegant in their simplicity. It's a single strand RNA that approaches basically any of the challenging mutations that are giving either proteins the wrong direction, not enough direction, or just direction in general that they shouldn't be. And so we're going to approach this with a couple of different modalities. The RNA is H dependent, which is basically our way of being able to cleave the RNA when there is an opportunity for us to actually knock down what's happening from a protein perspective that's a wrong signal, or splice switching, which is what Millicin, they named it after her, was. That really is where we actually design it to enable the expression of protein to be appropriate if you're lacking that expression. This as a design is not uncommon. Spinraza is a splice switching ASO, as you guys are probably aware. And then obviously in the Duchenne's area, splice switching has been a very popular approach. Now, when I first came in, we actually were, sometimes things just happen serendipitously and you just go with it, right? It's just luck. We had 2 patients that had been identified with the same Niemann-Pick C1 mutation, and they had been struggling to try to find treatment or anybody committed to Europe as an area for treating patients. It just so happened as I was coming in that they were asking if we could help them, and we had already started down the path of developing an ASO to treat that same mutation because Tim Yu had 2 kids in Boston that had the exact same mutation. So we were already creating it to see if we could do it. And as we were completing that, we made an agreement with Gosh that if you want to do this with us, then you'll be our first treatment center and you'll be our first kids. So that's when I had the fun to be able to go to my investors and say, well, hey, you've been talking about doing this for a while. We're actually going to do it. So we need to go out and raise money, and we're going to build a clinical trial. I'm not going to drain this because it's actually pretty small anyway, but this just gives you a general idea that the way we're going about developing the ASO is over-indexing to try to determine safety as well as, if we can, efficacy. Is there a biomarker against cholesterol and Niemann-Pick? That's one. But the reason that we're doing this is that when you consider a regulator and the way a regulator thinks, which is not the typical way to think, and they certainly don't have empathy or sympathy, I should say, for rare disease, we need to be as thorough as possible. So we're kind of walking through the front door with the requirements, knowing that we're going to have side door arguments to why they need to be able to approve products that we will not be able to study and that will never have been in a human before we're asking for them to approve it. So how do we go about that? So the idea here is that in the US, and this does not have to do only with the Trump administration and the fire sale that is going on at the FDA and HHS right now, which arguably that's going to be distracting anyway. But the FDA is a little slower than other countries in terms of embracing rare disease. Now, while the Rare Disease Innovation Hub was formed, and that brings 2 sides of the FDA together to try to address this, the science is way ahead of the regulators. And I know I don't need to tell this room that, but the issue within the US is they're not only distracted, but most of the guidance that they're giving is for research. It's not for treatment. And while the ASO guidance they gave for a 3-month GLP tox, that is a huge savings in the drug development phase, that's for research. It's not for treatment. And so that guidance wasn't really useful beyond that. They've also given guidance for platform designation. Seems or stands to reason that an antisense oligonucleotide It's basically 16 to 21 polymers. We're not doing a lot of difference in terms of the backbone. That is right for a platform designation, but they gave guidance that was vague. And their response to our initial conversations is, well, you've got to bring us data. Agreed. So where do we get data the quickest and the easiest? You do that in Europe. You can get a clinical trial authorization in Europe up and running. I would say breakneck pace compared to the US. It's still a hurdle, but that's why we're approaching it. And it just so happens that these two children that were being treated by the Great Ormond Street Hospital, that's one of the premier neurological centers in the world. Things were just kind of coming together almost too well for us to say, we have to move and we have to move as quickly as possible. So we started to put together a master protocol, and this is a variation on a theme you might have seen in oncology where they'll have one drug to treat multiple indications. And the idea is that they're not spending the next 5 or 10 years building out the medication. They're actually convincing the regulator that the chemistry is what you focused on. It's less about the condition, it's about the chemistry. And if we can show safety with the chemistry, if it's a severe and life-threatening illness, as you might see in so many different cancers, does it matter what the efficacy parameter is to the extent that you need to find a primary and secondary endpoint? No. It's that it's safe and it actually can show activity post-approval. So we're doing that, but we're flipping it on its head. And so instead of one drug, we'll 8, 9, 10 ASOs. We don't know how many kids that's going to treat. And I can't tell you how many times investors are like, well, how many patients are going to be in your trial? I don't know. Well, what do you mean you don't know? Well, each mutation is treating one child, but for instance, with the first one, they're treating 2 kids. Well, how many kids have this same mutation? I don't know. Well, how many in that country? I don't know. How many in the world? I don't know. We're going to find that out. But we do know that the more people do whole genome sequencing, the more we're going to find of these mutations that may be more common. The real trick is that if you have more than 5 or 10 or 15, like ataxia in Turkey, we're investigating that with Tim Yu, it's about 60 patients. I'm sorry to say that is too many. That is too many because I have to design a traditional clinical trial and go through the process to get that approved. That's not breaking the door open in the corner to show the regulators focus on the chemistry, not on the indication, and not on the primary and secondary endpoints. So that's one of the reasons why we are sticking to a very, very small population. So the other idea is that because these are such small populations, they're not all going to occur in one country. So we have started the process of working with GOSH, is the acronym for Great Ormond Street Hospital. We've been working with Paul Gisson and GOSH to find patients that have mutations that are amenable. We've already found 2 kids in Italy, same mutation, and there are several in Germany, and we've actually now visited the Middle East, and we were at Arab Health a couple of weeks ago. They are very proactive in this space, by the way, and have done genome sequencing on almost 1 million people in the Middle East. They didn't necessarily do it for medical reasons, but it doesn't matter why they did it. They have that information now, and so being able to run our mutations against their database is part of what the future part of our business model would be. If we have drugs in a library that can treat a mutation, and you find a child that has that mutation, then they need to be in touch with us as soon as possible. So the clinical trial will be across multiple countries. It'll be across multiple mutations. And so far, the regulatory feedback has actually been positive. Now, in the context of a regulator, the reason I say positive is if they don't shut you down, then you're saying I got a chance. So then if they'll say, well, what about the idea that we cannot, and frankly, probably should not have to do a GLP tox for every single ASO that we bring to you, that's a pretty crazy strategy, right? Well, that's the reason that we're going to have 8 of them. Repeatability over and over and over and over again, and talking to them about the second one, the third one, the fourth one, the fifth one. By the 5th, the 6th one, we've been in a very iterative process with these regulators. We're showing them every one of the assays we're doing, which is pretty much the same overlap with all of them. There may or may not be a biomarker, but we'll be able to explain why there is or isn't. And we will go to the greatest lengths, whether it's wearables, hopefully not burdensome surveys the parents have to complete, but any kind of baseline and post to show that there is evidence of effect. I'm not saying efficacy, I'm saying effect, because I don't know that you could ever state that the efficacy that a parent sees is the efficacy that a regulator cares about, if that makes sense. So with this, our trial design is to basically start as we will have our first 2 patients in trial in the fourth quarter of this year. We are already starting the design of 4 additional ASOs, and then we would hope to get up to 8. We may have more, we may have a little bit less, but that's the target right now. And then as we progress over the next year to 2 years, we'll get CTA approval in multiple countries. This gives us a wealth of data to negotiate a corridor with regulators for a new pathway. Now, is this a guaranteed? It's not, no. When I talk to investors about what we're doing, this gives us the best shots on goal to create a brand new pathway with regulators. But by 2027, 2028, we should have enough to go for approval through EMA as well as other countries in Europe. This strategy is really basically to convince Europe so that we can then, sorry, I'm in the wrong spot, aren't I? If we convince Europe, then that means that we convince the US. But this is the vision of where we want to be. Very much like Mila, when her symptoms showed up, they were because her mom noticed, but the symptoms had been there since birth. Newborn screening isn't here today, certainly not in this country. At some point it will. And someone asked me at one point, well, what happens when you get a newborn screen that has an NPC1 mutation or a Batten's disease mutation? I mean, are we going to treat our child at that point? That's a good problem to have at this point, because we don't even know what newborn screening is going to look like in the future, or much less how it's going to be reimbursed, but other countries are doing it. So this is what would be realistic today, as the symptoms would begin, and that means the clock starts. The best case is that a neurologist would do a knee-jerk reaction. If you've got rare, random neurological symptoms in an otherwise healthy 5-year-old, run a whole genome sequence. Just run it and see what you come up with. And if you can get any kind of cellular data from the patient, swab, I don't think urine and blood were there yet, but skin samples, then you can characterize that mutation and know what modality will work. In our case, an ASO, we could sequence an ASO within hours. And if it works, or we know that it's amenable, we can design it within 6 to 9 months. That means that a child with a previously unknown mutation, and I don't say disease state, right? Because there may not be a name for the disease, but an unknown mutation, we should be able to design, develop, sequence, manufacture, and deliver within 9 months. And that just means we need a truncated regulatory review in order to get it to the patient as quickly as possible. So our business model is all inclusive: diagnostic networks, treatment centers, obviously that we're on the drug and the manufacturing side of it, and then working with regulators and payers constantly throughout the process. You guys can read this, and I'm sure it's probably something that you already know anyway, but as I'd mentioned before, the science is way ahead of the regulators, and we know that. They know it too. And I think they're starting to respond and react, but our approach, and we hope others will take the same kind of approach, walk in their shoes with them, give them a reason to support you. And instead of theory, we have to bring them clinical evidence to have the conversation. And so while this is a very costly approach, and that's what the Series A is going to pay for, we feel like that this is the best possible way to find a brand new pathway that others can follow. CRISPR-Cas9, siRNA, I mean, there's a lot of great modalities out there, but Everyone Medicines, I think, is going to be at the bleeding edge, so to speak, of making sure that new pathway exists. If not ex-US, we can certainly try to bring it back to US if they agree. That's it.